Thanks, Jen. Hi, welcome everyone. There's over 100 of us, 130 at this point. That is really, really amazing to see so many folks coming out, especially given the last few days that we've had. But also it tells us the importance of these conversations, right? We've been witnessing a lot for over the last year, but also so much more in the last 10 days. And that so much has happened in our own community in Boulder and Colorado, and the links, the overwhelming intersections between these violences, that hopefully we can start unpacking them as we go today. So, I'm Nishant. I'm a faculty member in ethnic studies. So welcome to our event on anti-Asian racism. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge the traditional lands we are on. We are on Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho territories. And I say that not just as a symbolically, but also as we start thinking about anti-Asian racism, that how important it is to think about racism that Asian Americans and Asian people face in this country, how intrinsically it's linked to colonization of indigenous communities, right? And that we can't really think about fighting, resisting white supremacy and racism against Asian and Asian American communities without thinking about indigenous sovereignty and thinking about Black liberation, right? And hopefully these conversations will guide us as we go along in the conversations tonight, with thinking about the intersections of experiences of different racialized, colonized peoples, but also then to focus specifically on the specificities of what Asian American racism against Asian American people looks like, right? But how also it's deeply interconnected with anti-Blackness, with settler colonialism, with racism against Hispanics, Latinx peoples, with what happens at the border, with all the wars that US fights across the globe, right? So I wanted to start on that note to say that this is the grounding of how our conversation is going to start. I also again want to give a shout out to Arturo, who's under this event came into being within a matter of 24 hours. As a response to what happened in Atlanta, and it was his vision and leadership that allowed us to gather so quickly and organize something and to have this really, really urgent conversation, right? Joanne Person designed that beautiful poster that a lot of you would have seen, so I also want to give a shout out for that poster. And Virginia and Kat Lewis, who's here, have been helping us with all forms of navigating the bureaucracy and getting this organized event getting going. We are a little worried that we might get Zoom bombed, given the conversation we're having, and because the link, we made a decision to keep just the link and not do registration and whatnot, because we wanted to get the word out quickly and get community members in Colorado to also make it more accessible. So in case something like that happens, just a warning that we will, as the host, mute and turn off everyone's camera so that we can control if we get bombed. And if that doesn't solve the problem, then we will post a link for a webinar that we have as a third plan. And so if something happens here, there will be a link for a webinar that you'll see on your chats that we will reconvene there as quickly as possible if there's a disruption, right? Hopefully there won't be a disruption, but just because of the conversations we're having and how this is not a registered event, just we wanted to plan ahead if anything happens, right? We are also going to just share a statement that the Department of Ethnic Studies and Women and Gender Studies put out last week in relationship to what happened to Atlanta. So that'll be on your chat, along with the article that Jennifer mentioned that she published on CNN, just to ground our conversations, right? And so with that, I'm going to quickly introduce the speakers that we have. We have an amazing lineup of 5 really, really powerful, brilliant speakers. And the format of the event is that we prepared questions in advance that I'm going to post to the speakers, and we'll go through those questions in the next maybe an hour, and hopefully we'll have some room at the end to open up the conversation and think through all these things, and specifically also think about what happened in Boulder. The event is a response to what happened in Atlanta, obviously, but Boulder, the shooting that just happened, that how do we think about gun violence? How do we think about police? How do we think about conversations about abolition? How do we think about conversations around anti-Asian racism and Islamophobia? and mental health, right? And so hopefully we'll have more room to unpack those intersections, even though we start thinking about Atlanta, but obviously it is grounded in what we've all experienced in the last 2 days, right? Last 2-3 days. Yeah, so I'm going to quickly introduce the speakers and then we will jump into our questions. So it's my honor to introduce Luna. Luna was born and raised on Cheyenne-occupied land, Denver metro area, and moved to DC to complete her Master of Public Health program at George Washington University. Luna is passionate about learning and reflecting on how she shows up in her work for communities in the fight for justice and liberation, while volunteering with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, DC chapter, and the Sustainable Cultural Lab. Next, we have QC Phan. QC is the Denver regional organizer for the Colorado Migrant Rights Coalition. Graduated from the University of Denver, she currently has a BS in criminology and is multilingual in English, Vietnamese, and Mandarin. After immigrating from Vietnam at the age of 1, QC started in social justice work around 18 years old, focusing on issues like anti-Blackness in AAPI communities, gender equality, and LGBTQ rights through an AAPI youth conference named Rock the Boat. So we're really, really honored that we have two amazing activists like Luna and QC join us today to have these conversations, along with 3 brilliant, amazing scholars on our campus. First is Dr. Irene Blair, who's a chair and professor in psychology and neuroscience. Her research focuses on stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, particularly with regard to underlying subtle or implicit processes that underlie such events. Next, we have ethnic studies affiliate, Dr. Cheryl Begashira, who's an associate professor in English. She's the author of book Black Internationalist Feminism, Women Writers of the Black Left, 1945 to 1995. And lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Seema Sohi, who's an associate professor in ethnic studies. She's the author of Echoes of Mutiny, Race Surveillance and Indian Anti-Colonialism in North America. So it is with great honor that I introduce all these speakers to you. And I'm just gonna jump into the first question and take our conversation from there. So what has been missing in the coverage and conversations around anti-Asian racism in the wake of Atlanta killings? More generally, what is missing in popular and even progressive understanding of past and continuing violence against Asian and Asian Americans communities in the US? So any of you want to jump, who wants to jump can jump. Should I call someone? Luna, do you want to start us? Are you?
Perfect. Sorry, I think we have to ask the host to unmute us. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I graduated from CU Boulder in 2017, so it's always good to be back to discuss with the community, especially on the subject. As a student and now as a community member in the Colorado community, I think what is truly missing in the general conversation is just language. I'm sure folks have seen or read or heard of J. Caspian King, who recently wrote an opinion piece on there's kind of a lack of language to discuss ways in which violence is intersectional, right? And in so many cases for many Asian American communities, we kind of lack a centralized language, right, in terms of discussing white supremacy within our communities, because race as a social construct does not really make sense to a lot of like our immigrant communities. Even in discussing with my mother, like race to her, it's fascinating, right? Because it's like we want to deconstruct race as a social construct, right? Just abolish this racial hierarchy, right? So my mother understands that, but in so many ways, like we are also taught on US land to assimilate and to adopt this language and to enforce the policies and the practices that this language teaches us to, right? I think that is why we've been having so many hard, difficult conversations, and also have been lacking a lot of different frameworks, right? Because we lack this unified language to discuss it. And there are so many complexities here. You know, it is Asian women, it is working class women, it is sex workers, and our communities are very gatekeeper, right? Like we gatekeep a lot of who gets to be included in these conversations, who gets to be included in how we discuss these conversations, who gets to be included and who gets to speak up. And so I think that's, that's a lot of what we're missing here, is how in so many ways our movement is catastrophic because we lack a unified language. So many folks haven't really had the time to breathe, to process, to mourn, to grieve. It was almost immediately after Tuesday night, calls to action. We need to mobilize, go, go, go. So many aunties and uncles like started to mobilize, some for the very first time. And it was just truly catastrophic because in so many ways, because there is a lack of a unified language that we have as a community as a whole. There were a lot of, vigils and rallies that were in turn traumatizing and triggering for many folks in the audiences and for many of our community members, because I think we follow in a lot of other communities of color footsteps in terms of mobilizing, but we also haven't really taken, a move back to analyze how do we want to show up for one another? How can we approach this movement, this event, with radical love for one another, and to further develop, and cultivate a sense of community on this ethnocidal land? So thank you again for having me here. I'm excited to be in conversation and in community with you all, and to kind of process what we're all experiencing. But it's truly just, yeah, it's a lot right now.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Cheryl, would you like to go next?
Sure. I am so grateful to everybody for showing up, and it really means a lot to me, and I think to all of us. I want to start by saying the names of the women and people who were killed in Atlanta, and I apologize for any mispronunciations. Dayu Feng, Young Yu Yue, Hyunjung Grant, Suncha Kim, Xiaojie Tan, Soonjung Park, Ashley Yon, Paul Andre Mickles. I'm also hoping that all of you find and can get the care that you need to take care of yourselves at this really difficult time. So I think what I want to address is a word that's been coming up actually quite a lot, which is policing, and the kind of knee-jerk reaction that many of us feel when we're endangered and we're threatened on so many levels. And I've been hearing a lot about how Asian American communities around the US, including nearby. Nishant recently shared with me a story about the Westminster Asian American community, trumpeting its partnership with local police. And I know this is also happening with Vietnamese communities in San Jose and across the US. And I think it's really understandable at this time to want that as a sense of protection. But I think it's really important to uplift all of the grassroots community groups around the US, including Atlanta, who know that policing in the long term, as well as in the short term, causes much more racialized harm to all people of color and Indigenous people, and especially poor, working poor, people in low-wage professions, people working in massage parlors who are sexualized, who are subject to surveillance and deportation. And how policing is also linked to transnational violences and militarization. And thinking about what's going on with the most recent Boulder shooting, and how our Muslim and Arab brothers and sisters and folks are feeling yet again more traumatized and more profiled. I think we really need to be careful about how we think about safety and about reframing safety so that, that can come from communities rather than from policing, and putting more money into policing and militarization, which also hurts these diasporic people and their communities and families throughout the Asias and throughout the world, really. So I just, and I also want to remind everyone that we have some really great students and faculty and staff on campus with the Divest to Invest collective, who are really calling for putting our resources and money into the mental health care that we need, rather than into weapons and policing, so that we can really set our priorities straight and prioritize what our most vulnerable folks need.
Should I wait? Should I wait? Okay. I wanted to just, I'm always so grateful for Cheryl Higashida in being in these spaces, because yeah, I'm just always grateful for what she has to say. And I wanted to say that, I'm Seema Sohi, by the way, in ethnic studies. And I wanted to say thank you to all of you for being here. Some of you I haven't seen in over a year. And I just recognize, like, there are layers of trauma that run really deep. And it's just trauma upon trauma that I think a lot of us are facing to a different extent. And it's hard when you're not in community, kind of grappling with and processing this trauma. And so it's really lovely to see all of you, even if it's just in these little boxes. But I wanted to kind of build off of what Cheryl was saying, because I think in terms of this question of what's missing in the coverage, is part of the violence and its ongoing manifestations lies in the response too, right? And so, and when I say lies in the response, I mean how the media is representing it and where we go from here. And I've been thinking a lot about, how different actors try to seek to remedy or respond to violence. And so how often for many of us that just feels like another manifestation or iteration of violence. So I think what's missing is really an understanding of the functioning of violence in the society, and the centrality and the persistence and the ruthlessness of violence in the society that we live in. And one of the things that is so difficult about these consistent acts of racial violence, because they're consistent, they're relentless, right, is that each one again and again is treated as its own individual manifestation of a lone, deranged individual. And rather than, and I know a lot of you already know this, but rather than part of a historic and systemic and institutional set of problems, right? And so for Asian Americans, for many folks, right, but because we're talking about Asian Americans right now in the aftermath of Atlanta, this manifestation of violence, racial violence, is never an aberration, right? So if you ask BIPOC people in this country about violence, racial violence is a constant, or the threat of it, right, is a constant in our lived experiences. And so I think what's missing is an understanding of anti-Asian violence is part of the violence of the US itself, right? And it's constitutive of the US itself. And it can't be remedied, like Cheryl was saying, by the carceral state, right? And so how we come to understand that, and how we come to, I think, express that this is a violence rooted in settler colonialism, in slavery, in imperialism, in US militarization, right? And how that militarization and imperialism abroad comes home and manifests through violence. And I think we're going to talk about this in some of the other questions, I think is really important. And then finally, I would just say that, as a historian who studies obviously Asian American history, I think the extent to which Asian American exclusion or racial injustice has been understood, if it's known at all, which often is the case, it's not even really known, but to the extent that it is understood, it's very much rooted in, like, as an episodic sort of thing that happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Japanese, the incarceration of Japanese Americans, right? And then, but the thing is, even that treatment of those historical moments does this really important ideological labor on behalf of the US and on behalf of exceptionalism, because they're treated as these things that happened in the past, and they're acknowledged as mistakes, right? And then and they've been remedied, right? And then that remedy gets co-opted as evidence of America's triumph over racial injustices that are always located in the past, so that when these acts of violence happen, they're aberrations, right? And I think that it's in the narrating of the history that you then come to see how people process, or the media sort of is processing this now. And I think that's why the centrality of US imperialism and militarization has to be so central, particularly in terms of what happened in Atlanta.
Thank you, Seema. Irene, Chow, or either of you want to go next?
Sorry, were you saying me?
Yeah. Yeah, you can go.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk. And I didn't realize when those questions were sent out earlier, we were supposed to answer them. So that's okay. But listening to the conversation, I feel like there's a strong connection between what Luna was talking about and Seema and Cheryl in terms of the missing language, and my own personal experience last week was that these shootings occurred and they seemed very distant and disconnected from me. I work in a discipline, we don't have the language that you all have, so it comes so easily to you. And then I read Jennifer's piece, and that hit home so truly and authentically of, oh my God, that is me. And so that it gave me the language, and Seema, what you're talking about in terms of the violence and the idea that this is an exceptional case, or Asians do so well, this only happens in these very strange situations. But if we extend violence to violation, it's constant. It's violation of ourselves, our persons, that is not unusual at all. So in my mind, I'm just making these connections.
Thank you.
Awesome. And I guess I'll go next. Okay, can I just say, first of all, I thought this was going to be a space for an undergrad class, so you can just imagine how intimidated I am speaking in front of all of you. But no, I think everyone spoke so eloquently and so perfectly about it. I think the only thing I would really add, just with working directly with community, is I think what's missing from the conversation is just what we even define as violence. Like working with a lot of undocumented communities, like family separation and deportation, being detained, is violence in itself. And that happens literally every day. Just recently, 33 Vietnamese refugees were deported, right? And I think it's been really hard having these conversations, just because a lot of times we kind of define violence as a physical, or like a physical aspects in our life, like whether it's people getting beat up physically or through death. And we see that very obviously with what's been happening. And I think the other part of it is like a lot of the speakers coming out and like speaking on these topics, they just kind of tie in like more of the interpersonal violence that's been happening, which is horrible, and it happens to all of us in different forms. And it's even worse when it's motivated by hate. But there's a lack of connection to or the hyper focus of it, and the lack of connection to the state violence is where is where, it's really missing from the conversation, because at the end of the day, the interpersonal violence that we're facing is awful. But when we keep pushing for a lot of the solutions that you've seen, our communities have been pushing for, like more policing and, all this stuff, like anti-sex work. What happens is, like, a lot of the politicians and policies that, that we're looking towards for leadership will exploit these tragedies, for more money, more funding. And that's just going to recreate the violence in itself. So I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Okay, thank you everyone for starting us with those really, really key points for us to keep in mind as we develop the conversation and go ahead. But all of you raised so many important intersections. And so the next question, I think, leads up to this, to thinking specifically about the intersections of violences that Asian and Asian American women face, right? So this violence was against Asian American women. And so how do we understand the intersections of race and gender and sexuality through the historical violences and exclusions of Asians and Asian Americans in the US, but also contemporary forms of exclusion and violences that operate, right? Including the violence of the US military in different parts of the parts of Asia, and how then Asian women are hypersexualized through those logics, right? So I was wondering if you want to share, if you can share more thoughts about the experiences of Asian and Asian American women through personal lived experiences, but also historical and ongoing socio-political, economic processes. And then how do we also specifically understand the lives and experiences of Asian migrant sex workers, right? And the role, the figure of the Asian sex worker, the way it circulates in the US imaginary, right? And the violences then are imposed on sex workers who are often not sex workers, but are read as sex workers or are erased as sex workers, right? And so both the hyper-visibility and the invisibility of migrant sex workers in this context, right? So anyone can start, or I can also ask people. So, but if you want to jump in, please jump in.
I will quickly jump in, which I love silence, by the way, on Zoom calls. I think it's just a really good moment for us to just, like really honor that. But I will say there is such a rich history of sex workers supporting Asian American civil rights, the movement, even in Denver. I think it was 2017 or 2018, Asian Communities Together, we hosted a Denver guided tour to go over the 1880s race riots, which is where Denver's Chinatown used to be. That race riot was essentially cis white men who had just violently brutalized, destroyed, raided Denver's Chinatown in the 1880s, accusing folks, it's typical, this narrative we hear still today of white men accusing Asian men of stealing jobs from them, right? Also accusing Asians of being dirty, disease carrying. So again, similar narratives that we're seeing in COVID pandemic, right? Similar language that folks are using to also describe us. And also, like at the time, it was also known as Hop Alley. Now, in this area of Denver's Chinatown, which I believe, and I always get this wrong because I'm not good with street names, somewhere between 17th and 20th and Market, that kind of area. It was a lot of, opium dens, brothels. So during this race riot, Liz Preston, a brothel owner, actually helped bring in 4 Asian men who were running from the white men who were attempting to brutalize them, to cut off their Q, which holds their chi, their energy. It was blatant cultural disrespect. It was white men wanting to physically violate our cultural identities, things that mean so much to us as people, our identities, our essence, our existence. And Liz Preston brought in 4 Asian men who were running, and also, like her workers came out and were ready to just defend them and to fight back, punch back, any white man who was trying to physically harm harm our community, she fought back. So that's, just a part of local history, right? And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge, that is Denver history. Sex workers supporting, the Asian community from white supremacist attacks. I also think another part of this is just, I think Seema brought this up too, but we really just have to acknowledge US culture, right? Like, this racial hierarchy is a byproduct of the US's ethnocidal culture. And what ethnocide is in a similar vein to genocide, right? Genocide seeks not just to destroy culture, but also to destroy and kill people, right? To wipe out mass communities. Ethnocide is the destruction of culture while keeping the bodies for capitalistic exploitation. So we see this in the transatlantic slave trade, where they physically, like, they destroyed their culture to use them for their capitalistic labor exploitations. We see this throughout, like, for many communities of color, right? We think of the Transcontinental Railroad, where they sought to destroy our culture, our souls, our essence, our existence, to use our bodies for their own capitalistic labor exploitation. And it's also in our language and how we describe the violence that happens. The media minimalizes white violence and white supremacy to such a degree to make it seem so ordinary, because it is. This is a part of the US culture. So I think, for us to really understand and acknowledge, the racialized gender and sexual violence, we really have to acknowledge how this is the US's culture. It is embedded in the culture. It is the roots of this tree, and no matter if we cut the tree down, these ethnocidal roots will continue to affect any other tree that develops. And I think, we really have to understand, like, how heinous it is, and just how it permeates through so much, and is erased throughout history as well.
Anyone would like to? I go in my teaching mode that if I remain silent, then someone will respond. But then I'm like, no, this is not a class. So I have to keep reminding myself.
Seema, were you going to say something? Well, a couple of things I can add is that, Red Canary Song, which is also part of the Ethnic Studies and Women Gender Studies statement that it's linked to in support of that grassroots coalition supporting massage parlor workers. I just wanted to bring up that if you go to their website, this is such a difficult time in all ways, materially, financially, emotionally, but if you have the resources and inclination, you can donate. And there are a number of really great groups, and maybe I can type them in the chat, but I just wanted to bring that up in terms of ways to, also in Denver, the Asian Pacific Development Center, APDC, is another local organization that helps refugee and immigrant communities. So I just wanted to bring those up. Maybe one quick thing I'll add to address further the question, and to build on, Luna, your point about the kind of endemic systemic rootedness of these racial and patriarchal, anti-LGBTQ violences that are systemic, is that, again, if we think about this globally and internationally in terms of the military bases around the world, including in the Asias, in terms of just overseas bases, the hundreds of them, and I think something like 60 nations, those are sites for exploitative, racist and patriarchal sex economies where Asian women, are having structurally to engage in sex work, that these military bases foster that kind of violence. And so that's another reason that we have to think about what's going on in Atlanta as tied to the global violences of US imperialism, and also how the US histories of wars and Korea, which is ongoing, and as well as the wars in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. What's going on in Atlanta, and what's happened in Atlanta is the legacy of those US wars. In Korea, right? At least one of the women killed had been had come to the US from having had a marriage with a US soldier. So these violences are rooted in these historical wars and processes that Seema and Luna have been talking about. So.
Nishant, I don't know if this is going to be like that thing that happens in class where everyone always just sits in the same place, if we're going to just follow the same order that we followed on the same question. But what I think Luna and Cheryl are saying is, it's so important, because I think what it points to is also reframing sort of how we understand how Asian peoples have come to be in the US, right? So I think that, when I teach Asian American history, I don't use the term immigrant, I use the term labor migrant, which is to just get the students to think about a shift in the framing, right? And so, and I just appreciate this discussion about labor exploitation, and then understanding migrations as legacies of imperialism, and especially militarization, which I also think is really missing from the coverage, right, of what has happened. So, and I think, when we think about that kind of Cold War period, especially the sort of 1950s to like the 1980s, that is a moment in which the majority of people coming from Asia were women, right? And they're coming as a legacy of militarization across Asia. And I just think that is not really understood. And then also, I think that's also a time that people think of in the context of American history as sort of the age of inclusion, when all these exclusionary laws were lifted. But that inclusion, if we even can call it that, is occurring and is mutually constituted by the growing American militarization and presence across Asia. Those two things are not parallel developments, right? They are completely linked. And so I think we have to think about how this history of US foreign policy, of imperialism and militarization centered on domination and violence has impacted Asian women, both globally and in the US. These things cannot be separated, right? And so this is a history that is kind of, its foundation is violence, is US militarization and imperial violence, right? Which then prompts these migrations. And so I think that's super important to recognize. And then just in terms of sort of the question that you posed, Nishant, Kimberly Crenshaw had this really great quote that she released, or maybe some of you have seen it, and the African American Policy Forum, which said, to say the murderer's actions in Atlanta were about sexual desire and therefore not about race is a fundamental intersectional failure, right? And I think that's what we're seeing here, is a complete failure to even understand, right, what must be understood, which is, right, how we think about this intersectionally, like how there are clearly racial dimensions to the hypersexualization of Asian women and Asian American women. You cannot take those things apart, right? You just simply can't. And I just think that denial is reproducing an environment that makes this violence against Asian women, it's just making them more vulnerable, right, to this kind of racialized, sexual, gendered violence.
I think we lost QC. I don't know if QC is back. Irene, would you like to add? You're on mute. So you're still on mute. So I think a bunch of us are trying to unmute you. Maybe one of us. Okay.
Is that there now? Okay, good. I clicked a lot of buttons. Yeah, I think the intersectional dimension of this is super important. And, you know, I think for Asian women and for women of color, maybe more broadly, we get denied kind of all category identities. we get denied the racial category, you know, that race is often seen as the, you know, it's about men, that's kind of the quintessential racial category, you know, that I'm not viewed as Chinese myself. But we also get denied being female in this particular cultural context anyway. At the same time that we're hypersexualized as really objects. So we're denied our humanity at the same time. And it's a very strange place to be in, I think is really the only comment I have on that.
Thanks. I think QC is having internet issues, so they'll join us when they can, and we can move to the third question. But just to add to all these conversations, I think what has also been missing in thinking about violences that Asian American women face and Asian women face in the US is that the first xenophobic anti-immigration law that was passed in the US was against Chinese women. Right, we think a lot about immigration and we think a lot about what deportation does and what is happening right now, but we forget that the first law was passed on the bodies of Chinese women in 1875 because Chinese women were seen as quote unquote prostitutes, some women who are immoral, women who are bringing diseases, aka that meant that they were threatening white heteronormative families, right? And so all of that has been missing in the last week, but also just thinking about Asian American women generally, that the first violence that this country as a sovereign country, fake sovereign country, obviously on indigenous lands, made was on the bodies of Asian women to see them as prostitutes, right? And that conversation has not changed in terms of how specifically East Asian, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander women are seen by the US, right? Through all these military projects that we're talking about, but that for the US, Asian women are quote unquote immoral and quote unquote will bring diseases to this country, right? And also just to thinking about the question of policing, there have been multiple incidences in US where police have attacked Asian sex workers and the places that they work, right? Which have resulted sometimes in deportation and sometimes resulted in death, right? There was a death in 2017, I think, at a massage parlor in New York where cops were raiding Asian run massage parlor and women were trying to run away and one person died in that encounter, right? And so cops are never going to be the solution of any of these things, right? And I can keep going on this tangent, but another thing that what Luna was talking about, what happened in the Denver's Chinatown that night when the riots happened and one Chinese man was killed, the cops responded by incarcerating all Chinese men for the night for their protection, right? So the white men who were roaming the streets and destroying Chinatown and mob killed a Chinese man, their solution was that let's put Chinese men behind bars so quote unquote they'll be protected, right? And so now that Asian communities want to go to the cops for protection or asking for safety, that Asian folks have also always been criminalized and racialized in similar ways, not similar ways, but those histories of what we think about policing as a Black issue, which it is central to Black liberation, but also that all communities, BIPOC communities have faced police violence, and that Asian communities now going to cops as safety is not just anti-Black, but also goes against the histories of Asian racialization in this country, right? So maybe with that, we can jump to the next question, which I think a lot of you, given that we have so many people, it's amazing to see so many people. Thank you so much for a night where you could be anywhere, especially what has happened in the last 2 days. So that so many of you are here, really, really appreciate and are honored that you're here. But we thought maybe the question that we can go to next is to thinking about what is Asian American, right? So we use the word Asian American, or people have been using that word a lot in the last few weeks, in the last week, and since COVID started. But what work does the so the question that I have for the panel is, what work does the category Asian American do? Why is it important? Important framing, but what are possibly the pitfalls or the shortcomings of the term Asian American? And I think QC is back, or maybe not. I think
I am.
Okay.
Thank you. Was that a subtle way for asking me to go first?
I'm trying to find you on my but you can go first. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, I'll try to answer this as best I can. I think for myself, I think that the easiest way to think about the work that Asian American and how it frames itself is it gives us political power. And you know, it kind of gives a sense of like a collective whole with all Asian folks who is in the US, right? But I also do not like the term Asian American. I actually don't really identify with that term, just because I think there's such violence in, you know, identifying as American, especially for someone who, you know, because of the war that happened in Vietnam, like have been displaced. And I think what usually happens with in terms of like the failing of this term is like we collect, like it's a collective challenge for us, because we tend to think of like, you know, the idea of like white supremacy is something that happens domestically, but then imperialism is something that happens, you know, abroad. And so we kind of like cherry pick a lot of the issues that we want to talk about, but then not recognizing that what the US does inside of its borders also happens outside of its borders. And so, you know, and so like, again, like with Asian American, because like that term is so broad and so vague, like there never will be like a collective understanding of what it means for a lot of folks. I don't know if that makes sense. And I'll pass it on.
That made a lot of sense. Thank you. Anyone else would like to go next?
Oh, I can jump in. I'm not good with silences. I get really antsy. So I'll try to be really quick. You know, I'm working on social movements in the 1960s, including the US Third World strikes for ethnic studies that started at San Francisco State College and UC Berkeley, you know, and you know, CU Boulder is also, you know, an important site for one of the first departments. So, I mean, we are part of this history. And, you know, at that time, you know, students and workers and community members of Asian descent, you know, in the 60s were really coming together for the first time under this Pan-Asian ethnic collective. I mean, before that, you didn't have Asian American struggles. It was, you know, Chinese and Japanese and Koreans struggling against, you know, and often pitted against each other, right? But, you know, this was this moment where you had all of these different ethnic groups coming together, you know. Also, what was so interesting, though, is that it was also a very internationalist, coalitional moment where there was all of this alignment with Black and Indigenous and Chicanx and Latinx groups, Puerto Rican independence movement activists. And, you know, Daryl Maeda writes brilliantly about this. And so it's just really interesting that at this moment that you have a kind of formation of Asian America, it's also very multiracial and internationalist. And I think it's always important to hold those two things together, the kind of identity in difference and difference in identity. And maybe that's something that we can think back to when we have to sort of, I think, productively question, what is Asian America, and how can we activate the possibilities of that identity instead of use it to assume assume an identity that can elide important differences of sexuality, gender, and also class, because there's a big difference between, for example, going back to what's happened in Atlanta, those parlors, and not just are the managers, but also like these, really powerful and problematic business people who are making a lot of profit off of those massage parlor workers. So class is also really important to think about, and how Asian America is becoming the most stratified ethnic group in terms of that polarization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously this category of Asian American is a kind of a somewhat recent invention, right? That it came out of the late 1960s as a political choice and as a political act, that I think is really important. And yet I know very few people who identify as Asian American, right? Personally, like in terms of sort of their own identity. And so I guess the question is really, how do we sort of mobilize and utilize the Asian American for political purposes, right? Is what I'm interested in sort of thinking through. And I appreciate what's been said about this question so far, because I think that it becomes a question then of how we extend the politics and the mobilization and even the analysis beyond the borders or boundaries of our own communities. And I think, and in some ways, this is kind of in relation to the last question, which I'm not jumping to, but I'm just alluding to, about solidarity. Like what solidarity looks like is, how do we move beyond the boundaries of our own communities? And I don't know about people here, but, for me and my own community, coming out of sort of we're Sikh Americans. I haven't even sort of heard people talk about what happened in Atlanta. And that's really hard to say, actually, right? That there's so little connection that has anything to do, right, with our community. And it's that sort of, that's what makes the category Asian American so unsettling in some ways, because there should be a recognition or acknowledgement. And yet, in my personal experience, there rarely is. Okay. And but at the same time, when something happens against our community, right, which has happened with great frequency, always, but especially since 2001, and certainly with 2012 in Oak Creek, there is always an appreciation, right, when other folks come and in solidarity. That gesture actually means a lot. And I've seen sort of among some of people in I'm trying to make a distinction though. I'm talking about the elders or people who maybe aren't involved. Like there are Sikh American activist groups that emerged out of 9/11 that I think are doing really important coalitional work, and are really trying to connect the experience of what it means to be Sikh American in the US to other communities, that I really appreciate and value. And so I think that's what's really hard for me about this, sitting in this space of Asian America, because to me, we have to be in solidarity with other folks, and we have to be willing to engage beyond what we think are boundaries. Because to me, those boundaries don't even exist. Because if we think about our shared history in America, we do have a shared history with lots of different folks, Asian American and even beyond. And that, unfortunately, that history is one that's premised upon racial violence, right? And so I think that category is so difficult. And I find in my own experiences, sometimes a real frustration, right? When I see a kind of reaction where it's like, well, that doesn't really have anything to do with me, and it does. because and these manifestations of violence, like that's to me how we kind of forge solidarity, right? In some ways, is how we organize against all the various forces that allow that violence to keep occurring over and over again.
We take questions and comments at the end. So if you can, folks can just keep their thoughts and questions for another maybe 10 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to get to all questions. Maybe just to keep thinking about the category, and as a follow-up question to the panelists, thinking about what we called, or in colonial geographies is called Middle East, right, which is technically West Asia, but how Middle East is not treated in the category of folks who are Arab, Persians, and Muslims generally. Building on the question, the point that Seema, you're raising about Sikhs specifically, but also South Asians generally are also sometimes left out of the imagination of what Asian American is, but definitely folks who are Arabs, Persians, and Muslims are also from the continent of Asia, right? What I tell my students in my classes is Asia has 52 countries, right? And so the category of Asian American doesn't make sense, but also it makes sense, a lot of sense within the context of US and US's imperial politics, but still we lose sight of what happens in West Asia, right? And how these are seen as different forms of imperialism, even though the military is there, has done similar things or worse things now in West Asia than it did in Southeast Asia and East Asia, right? So if folks want to add more to that of the category of what is the Middle East and how does it belong in Asian American imaginaries or not? Cheryl, I see your head, you're nodding your head.
You know, I just thought about how, yeah, after 9/11, kind of building on Seema, your point about how these racial violences become moments also for making connections and building these solidarities. You know, for Japanese Americans to come out and say, you know, hey, we recognize all these calls for internment camps. No, we're not going to stand for it. And it was a really important moment for, as you're saying, Nishant, like getting beyond this East Asian centric notion of Asian America, which, you know, leaves out, yeah, I mean, Filipino Americans, Vietnamese, Cambodian, right? Americans. And so that just came to mind as really needing to hold Seema's point about keeping these histories in mind and how they keep getting reactivated, these kinds of calls for incarceration and profiling.
Yeah.
I want to quickly jump into something I've been thinking about. This is very much so a first draft thought, so definitely want to welcome others' thoughts as well. But really, for me, I have been thinking so much about like how I identify as Vietnamese Chinese and how that's kind of purely the result of border wars and imperialism and the result of colonization, and how, yeah, just because, you know, like in talking with my parents, there was a lot of movement and migration during the Vietnam War between Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, and how it just, yeah, like my own, you know, personal history, my family was very nomadic, and we traveled a lot, we moved around a lot. And so like this question of like what is Asian American, who's included, to me is, you know, we define this umbrella term as a result of violence, right, in order to claim something for ourselves instead of responding to the name that white violence and supremacy and other colonizing countries have imposed onto us, right? We chose Asian American to avoid being called yellow, Oriental. That was a choice that we made in response to white supremacy. And so it's something that I think about a lot because, you know, can we reimagine, what a more inclusive name would be for us when we are not trying to respond to white violence? And I think about how so many other movements have also renamed themselves. So many communities have also renamed themselves to seize like communal power, right? And identifying themselves in a country that wants to erase us, wants to erase where we came from, wants to erase the ancestral practices and cultural practices that our ancestors, bestowed onto us. So I have no no answer, just a lot of first draft thoughts in terms of, like how do we even want to reinvent ourselves, or do we want to, return to ancestral practices? And it's a difficult question that, we have not been given the time to, because of how the US just wishes to erase us as a whole, and our communities as a whole as well.
Those are definitely not first draft thoughts. They're really, really pronounced and layered, right? And really important questions about how to identify in the face of white supremacy, right? And think, yeah. And so maybe with that, we can just go to the last question about thinking about coalitions, which we are already started thinking through this answer. But how do what we can call Asian Americans or Asians in the US, how to form better alliances with Black, Indigenous, Chicanas, Latinx, undocumented refugee communities through these shared histories, right? That Asian Americanness comes through shared history of resisting and organizing against racism and white supremacy. So what are your thoughts about how do we do that kind of work? What are the challenges? And maybe what are some historical or contemporary examples where we can take inspiration from? And we can do that for maybe next 5 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have 15 minutes to take questions and comments from the audience. Right? So I said a lot of different things, but what are the challenges of doing this work, or what should we be doing in terms of building coalitions, and what can we take, or who can we take inspiration from? Should I call out folks? Maybe since we were already talking about policing, and Cheryl, you shared the example of what was happening in Westminster. Maybe we can think about complicities of Asian Americans and policing, and what does it mean to go to the cops as safety or for safety?
I was actually going to answer the first question about coalition building. Maybe I can let someone else answer.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think, I was mentioning the 60s, and, again, Professor Daryl Maeda has really great work on, Black and Asian solidarities. Actually, this does tie to your point, Nishant. I mean, if we think about like the Red Guards in China, they took their inspiration from the Black Panthers in Oakland, who had started in Oakland and of course spread throughout the US. And, it's such a great, I think, one great example, because part of the reason the Red Guards were so inspired by the Panthers is because they were constantly, these are like Chinese youth ne'er-do-wells, right? They were getting into trouble for like stealing cars and drinking on the streets and whatever. And, they tried to set up a pool hall, and the pool hall would always get raided. So they're these youth, right? And it just goes to show they weren't the model minorities. This is going on in just like 10 years after, the US News and World Report about like Asian Americans as the perfect, Chinese Americans as the perfect model minorities. And these are like, Chinese Americans saying, screw that. And, they're constantly getting busted, right? And so, they realize the need for self-defense. armed self-defense, and to have this real critique of policing. And so, you know, that's a great, I think, historical example, you know, that, and we see that resonate into the present with, you know, Asians for Black Lives, and many, you know, Asian Americans, I think, increasingly becoming more critical of the model minority and the violence that it's built on, and the anti-Black, anti-Brown, anti-Indigenous violence it perpetuates. And so, you know, yeah, I think that's that nodal point of state violence is one way. I mean, it is reactive, but I think it can lead us to be more proactive, as Luna was saying, of also having that kind of security then to be able to reclaim our heritage and culture and maybe build something completely alternative and transformative.
I mean, and I guess I would also add to the brilliance that Cheryl just said, that we have examples from the past, right? And so I think it's this idea that we have to, I mean, I'm all for it and completely agree with sort of imagining something entirely new, like understanding that none of this is natural or inevitable, right? And how can we move forward in that way, and how can we talk to people about these struggles in that way, right? It doesn't have to be like this, right? And so I think about sort of after, I think about the late 60s, right, the Asian American movement, which was so anti-colonial and anti-capitalist at its core, right? And then even sort of the mobilization that happened after Vincent Chin's murder, right? And so when Vincent Chin was horrifically murdered in 1982, and sort of Helen Zia and other activists from Detroit and New York, right, who organized and who really mobilized and made this a national issue. So that case would not have been a national issue if not for that mobilization. And that mobilization wasn't just, it wasn't, we want these two men to go to prison. It was about understanding the roots of anti-Asian racial violence, right, as inseparable from so many other larger forces. And so they were really, a lot of these activists diagnosing the problem sort of at the root, right? They weren't sort of saying, here's our reaction to this, right? They were diagnosing the problem at the root, right? This is a manifestation of all of these other problems, right? I mean, and some of them went so far as to even locate it in institutionalized slavery, right? In settler colonialism, in racial capitalism. And so we do have these examples in the past. And I think the strength of all of them lies in understanding that, and I keep having this quote from Linda Sarsour going through my mind, which is that solidarity is our survival, right? It's not an option. It's not like, oh, let's just try this and see if it works. Like, it is essential to our very survival, right? And none of us can do it on our own. No group or community can realize this transformation on their own, that we need one another, right, to kind of battle against these forces. And so to me, that's what solidarity is. And I think that's what's really required, right, in this moment. And I think people are doing it. And I think that's what's making this moment bearable, frankly. Yeah.
Maybe on that note, we can open up for questions, and if folks want to respond to the previous questions, we can also do that. But we can still try to have 15 minutes of questions and comments, and where people are. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll try to monitor them, or you can also pose it to everyone on the chat, and I will try to see the chat and who has their hands up. And if you have your hands up, we'll try to unmute you. So Khalil, I see your hand.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to say thank you all for sharing your opinions, your experiences. All been very, 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 very wonderful. I was just hoping if someone can clarify what the word exactly solidarity solid solitary means, because I heard there was a bunch of different explanations going around. I just want to have like something concrete on what exactly solidarity means.
That's a great question to start us off. Yeah, thank you for that question. Anyone would like to try answering, defining, or?
Khalil, I just want to clarify. So I know how to approach this solidarity, a definition or an approach for solidarity. Okay, perfect. You know, I say this with much love for the community, but like we really need to stop uplifting cis East Asian men on this issue who have never truly spoken up on any of this before. You know, I'm thinking of Daniel Dae Kim, whose approach is also not very transformative justice oriented and was rooted, you know, in hunting down folks who perpetuated harm and violence against others, which is violent in itself, right? You know, this panel already, like it's amazing. You know, centering, uplifting the most marginalized, the most vulnerable voices is solidarity to me, and making sure, you know, to continuously, you know, do your own research. I'm very hesitant to say just Google it, because as we know, Google is incredibly racist. The algorithms are geared towards tunnel holing you into a specific, you know, political alignment. So I'm hesitant to say that. And also I'm hesitant to, you know, boost reading lists, because reading lists will not be the revolution, solely reading lists. It's definitely a tool and, you know, educating ourselves. But yeah, I think truly, you know, and I dropped a link to an amazing article Michelle Kim wrote. And I want to, you know, plus one what Seema said, we do not need to reinvent the wheel on solidarity. It has been done before. It has been done across class, gender, queer movements, and we can definitely model and uplift and highlight things that have been done in the past and bring them to light here, especially because of America's ahistorical timeline. History erases all the time. My history books in school stopped right before the Cold War. I never learned anything past I didn't even get the Cold War. So, you know, we really need to establish a very people-centered historical timeline in the US.
One thing I would just add is I think, you know, solidarity has to really, especially on US soil in the US, has to both get beyond the US to be more global and international in scope, so that, you know, those of us who have the privilege of living in the belly of the beast are cognizant that our, you know, what our privilege what our privilege is built on, you know, how we are getting COVID vaccines. It's a zero-sum game that we get COVID vaccines that will not go to other countries. And we also have to be at the same time looking outside, but also really rooted and aware of, you know, the lands that we occupy, and to be to challenge that kind of exceptionalism in that way, to be aware of the settler violence that we also benefit from.
Okay, maybe we can take the next question. Lauren,
Hi, everybody, for this just really rich conversation. I just had more of a comment, I guess, than a question. And I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of add, and it goes to the question of people in the AAPI community. It doesn't even make more, oh, so glad you're vaccinated. Are you walking by yourself? And like, there's a great sadness. Like, so I'm Hapa, my dad is white. And it's a great grocery store now because then people can't see my face. And there's just an incredible sadness for not just for first generation, but for second, third, and because these are people imperial names, really British statement of generations who believed that this would achieve safety. So that was just to kind of add to that.
Thank you for sharing that. Melanie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi, my name is Melanie Ray, and I am a Filipino immigrant, and I have a direct experience of US imperialism in my country. I live in South Korea, where I see all my fellow Filipino women become an accessory wives to many US soldiers. The term juicy girls, japayuki, are very common derogatory words for most Filipino here in the US. We are coded as model minority, yellow peril of sex. So when the Atlanta shooting happened, it created a lot of anxiety for me. So I am thankful that I have this opportunity to have a discussion with you guys to share my experience. As an Asian immigrant, I am questioning the large institutions like governments, churches, and large group who have an enormous power to denounce patriarchy. Especially my church, the church that is already have a program for Robert Long to fix his sexual behavior, but most church are not denouncing this, and it's kind of hard for them to kind of deal with the issue. I guess it's kind of hard to accept that they themselves are making huge contribution in perpetrating the stereotypes and all of these atrocities against Asian women. In that, I abstain.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Really, really deeply appreciate everything you just said. I see Danielle's hand up, but there was a question from Ming in the chat that I just received before Danielle, so maybe we can take that and then move to Danielle. So this is a question, I think it's related to what Seema was talking about. The question says, your comments about Sikh elders and Nishant's about West Asian and Middle East not expressing or feeling as much solidarity with AAPI is making me wonder how the recent Boulder shootings would alter the narrative in light of the suspect being a Syrian immigrant and Muslim.
I mean, I think I don't know, to be honest with you, Ming. I mean, I hate that I can sort of anticipate, what is going to happen, and it's hard to know. I think how what happened here is going to be treated. I mean, yeah, I don't really know. I hope that communities come out sort of if we do see the sort of, I mean, I know we're already seeing it, but I hope communities do come out and speak out against the kind of Islamophobia that I think we can anticipate if we're not already encountering, because it's happened obviously too many times. And I can only speak on behalf of my own community, and I'm involved sort of with like the Sikh Coalition in particular, and I think the Sikh Coalition has been really good about calling out any inclination within our own community to kind of go down a particular path. I think that, and I respect the work that they're doing around that.
Thank you. Danielle, would you like to go? Oh, you got me unmuted for a second, then got muted again. Yeah.
Okay. I'm having a hard time forming a question exactly, so I apologize. And this is very much a rough draft question. I like that term that Luna used earlier. I'm the executive director of the Center for Asian Studies here on campus, and we have been having a lot of the conversations that I imagine you folks have been having about sort of what is the role we can play in addressing the racism and raising visibility, in this space. And I think the contribution that we make every day in our curriculum and sort of all of our activities across campus is trying to help students develop intercultural sensitivity and competency and recognize the value in all of the different cultures of Asia and sort of what we can learn from each other and to just stop fearing each other, right? I think that's the main thing that we can do. But in this moment, as we're trying to figure out how do we put together, an event or a response that is respectful and relevant, I am very sensitive to the fact that it is not appropriate for me to be speaking on behalf of Asians or Asian American community members. And at the same time, I am very aware of the harm and the hurt and the sense of sort of exhaustion and the weight that this work carries on the individual people. And so I guess my question is, are there specific things that we can do to make sure that we are centering Asian and Asian American voices without speaking on their behalf? I want to be really sensitive to that, but I don't quite know what the first kind of how to get into that without making the same people on this panel be on our panel.
Thank you for that question. I just want to do, it is 7:32 and more than 100 of you are still here. So I think we should carry on the conversation for at least another 10 minutes. So thank you for staying. But if you're leaving us, thank you for joining us tonight. The recording of this would be posted, I assume, on the Ethnic Studies website and CHA's website. So if you're looking for it, please email one of us, or you can go through Ethnic Studies or the Center for Humanities and Arts for the recording. And yeah, so anyone would like to take that question?
I'm just going to say maybe this is where the reading lists come in. That I appreciate what you're saying about not having the same people called on over and over and over again, and yet wanting to center the voices that need to be centered. And so I think, yeah, this is where the awesome writings and videos and everything that has been put out there is so very helpful.
Well, it seems like, it's great that this is recorded because, this could be one of the, texts that's uplifted, that, also the ethnic studies and women and gender studies statement, which I think was so powerful and so of this time, it can be, a statement that's shared on your website, maybe with, I don't know, I'm just speaking off the top of my head, but with a framing statement, this is why, Asian studies, and you make your own ties. But, there's so much work that we are doing that can be uplifted, not just by, cutting and pasting, but by, framing it to, teaching it in your class. Like when we had the scholar strike teach-in, right? And people used all kinds of YouTube videos and the webinar with all of the, students, many of them women of color, people are, we are doing this work on this campus, and there are ways that, again, since this recording is here, you can keep sharing it and the statement.
And just to add, I think there are so many different Asian communities in Colorado that I've only been here for the last 2 years, and I'm amazed how diverse these communities are and how little we recognize the diversity between Asian and Asian American communities, right? And there are folks who are not more, who don't fit the tropes of model minority, and who are coming because of wars or imperialism in their countries, or who are coming because their lands are occupied, right? And so, specifically thinking about Tibetan and Kashmiri folks who live in Colorado, and yet they don't get that visibility within the framing of what Asian American is. So I think for all of us to figure out ways that we can also expand what Asian American means to us, right? And to see what does it mean to talk about anti-Chinese racism, but also to think about China not through what Biden and Trump tells us, but what Tibetans and Uyghurs tell us, right? And so we can critique Trump and Biden, but also Tibetan and Uyghur Muslims have very specific experiences of Chinese imperialism, or Kashmiris have a very specific experience of Indian colonization, and so we can critique what Biden and Trump and others might say, but also the intersections of these violences that people have lived through in this broad category of Asian American or Asia, and to create platforms for those voices to be centered more, right? I see there's a whole bunch of questions on the chat. I want to be mindful of the panelists' time, and so I'm happy to stay, and I think we still have 88 people. This is really amazing. So thank you for everyone for staying here and wanting to engage more. So I see 2-3 different questions or comments. There's a question. What resources are available for AAPI people in Boulder specifically, just to meet and coexist in light of Atlanta, but also just being in Boulder, Longmont in general? I feel very much like an outsider now and feel a little comfort anytime I see another AAPI person. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I don't have the name, but yeah. I can start. There's so many different. I guess we as the panelists and all our different intersections of being Asian are here. So please feel to reach out to any of us, I would say. But there's also community groups like what Luna represents, Asian communities together, who've been organizing in Denver and creating broader coalitions. There's the Asian Pacific Development Center, right? Is that what Cheryl it's called, right? They are doing amazing work. There's an activist group, Asian American activist group called CORE, which also does, which has been doing some organizing work in Colorado. Yeah, others want to add other spaces where Asians people can connect.
Nishant, I want to just add to what you're saying and sort of going back to Danielle's question, which is to just reiterate what Nishant said, that there is a diversity of Asian American folks in the Denver metro area who I think are really invisible in a lot of ways. And I occasionally will get students in my classes and they're from this area of different communities. And I think that having Luna and QC here, and I just want to give a huge shout out to Nishant for doing that. I think it's so valuable, right? And I think, I wonder if sort of just Danielle, I'm saying this in relation to you because you asked the question, but if there's a way to facilitate more conversations, because I think having QC and Luna here is so important, because this isn't just abstract, like, you know, oh, I could say, oh, you could take my Asian American Studies class or something, and they're like, okay, yeah, I don't, what else is there? But I think to just know that there are sites and spaces and folks and organizations doing this work, and how we can really bridge this incredible divide between the campus and the larger community of folks, particularly around the Denver area, because sometimes it just feels like two separate worlds. And I think a lot of students and faculty and staff, a lot of us would love to have more opportunities, right, to bring these spaces together, because it's just so much more meaningful. I think when like to be in conversation with QC and Luna was really meaningful, I think, for me and for other folks as well. So I think that would be, and I'm not going to put you on the spot, Danielle, but I think for other sites on campus that they should also pay folks to come and do this labor, right? That they should give folks a stipend or something to kind of acknowledge the labor that they're doing. But I just think that it's not, sometimes living out here in Colorado, I'm not from here, I sometimes feel super isolated and like I'm just sort of, I don't even, I'll admit I came from California, but I feel like I'm super isolated, and then I meet folks and I'm like, wait, I'm not isolated. There actually are people here, and how can we use this space and this momentum to really build on a connection that I think has started, right, in this space.
The floor is open. I don't see a specific question in the chat room, chat box. So if folks want to just jump in, raise your hands to say things, ask questions, or share comments.
Wait, I'm just gonna add one thing as well, is this past year, in organizing with various communities and being in community in a virtual space, so weird, so awkward, so odd. And it's been also transformative in so many ways in our ability to increase access, right? And to not really have to require folks to be physically present, but like very much so in touch with one another. And yeah, I think that thoughtfulness is something I'm definitely going to take away with me if we ever move into a post-pandemic world, which is just odd for me to even imagine. But something I've been really doing and trying to investigate in myself is returning to what feels innate to me. And again, I really do not feel that it is any person of color's choice to immigrate to the US. And I think that narrative is so often told with Asian Americans and the Asian diaspora, that we chose to immigrate here for a better life, when in reality, US imperialism and military forces forced us here. And it wasn't even my mom's choice to be here in the US. You think my mom wanted this shitty healthcare system? Hell no. She chose Germany, but they wouldn't let her. So that's why we're here. But I really want, I'm so curious to hear other folks, but like something I've really been trying to do is research my own ancestral practices and reroot myself in that in order to start to heal and start to establish some sort of, transformative healing process for myself. As we're still folks on stolen land, and we are still, dishonoring this physical land. And I think another, huge point I've been trying to think about is this physical disconnection from my motherland, right? And how that also permeates and impacts and affects the Asian American experience, because in addition to this narrative that we are told about how we chose to immigrate here, how we chose to come here, how we chose to migrate here, there's also a physical disconnection with that physical land in itself as well. So I think, those are things that I've been thinking about as I'm seeking, and also thinking about what it means to show up and to be in community with other Asian Americans.
It is a little too late for me to be silent. So there's so many of us here. So anyone who wants to jump in. Nick, you had a question before, or a comment. Do you want to share that?
Actually, my question was answered by Dr. Sohi, and this discussion of what Asian American means, because I tell people, don't call me Hispanic. I don't identify that way. So it's much more complex than that. So that was answered, but there was just something, it's more of a comment that I'd like to make, that going back to the first question about language and the language, what is missing? Well, what is missing to me is that when we use the word shooter for these episodes, it's been dehumanized. No, it was a male shooter, or a man shooter. And if this happened to be a woman, well, then there would be this gender marking of, oh, we had a woman shooter, but it has become so dehumanized that we expect violence among men. And then, of course, then this happening, what happened in Atlanta to these women is just horrific. So it's just the language that's really bothering me that that is actually used. And then lastly, I just happened to be driving today to the mail distribution center, which is across the street from the, I guess the police department. And I did not know that. I had to pick up something for the distribution center. And there's this huge memorial out there for the officer, and no disrespect to the loss of life by the officer who, was a father of 7, but how many children did any of those women have? We're not hearing this. She was a mother of 4. But for this officer the other day, I'm sure everyone here that has read anything knows that the officer had a family and how many children. And there's this level of more importance to that loss of life than all the others when I'm speaking about Boulder, because you read the news and there were 10 victims. One was a police officer, as if to elevate that as to have much more meaning. And so it just angers me, and I just had to get that off my chest as something for conversation.
Just to add to that, the first press conference that the BPD had on Monday, right? It was Monday evening. It feels for so the first press conference, when they announced that the cop was killed, they did not announce how many other people were killed. They just said a cop died, a cop died, a cop died, a cop died, and we don't know how many other people were injured or harmed, right? The number 6 and 10 came much later. 6 came through leaking, through media reporting, but BPD didn't claim that, and then 10 came later in the second press conference. But the first one was this cop who served us for 10 years, and he did this leadership role and that leadership role, whereas the 9 other lives, they had no space in the first press conference, right? And so, and the narrative since then has been that we know so much about the cop, even if you don't want to know anything about him, and yet the other 9 people, like as if their lives don't matter in this context, right? So maybe we can end. I feel like I have weird power, like we can stay or end, but it is 7:47. So yeah, can I get some thumbs up too? And maybe, okay, cool. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for staying so late with us. Thank you for letting us, for witnessing this conversation and joining the conversation. I feel it was much needed on this campus, but also just generally across the country, right? So I really deeply admire every one of you who's been here and all our panelists. So if we can just give a round of big applause to all our panelists, and to Joanne, Virginia, Arturo, Jennifer, and Kat for helping us with all the logistics and the advertisement and whatnot. With that,
thank you, Nishant.
Yes, thank you, Nishant.
Thank you, Nishant.
Yeah, thanks to you all. Thanks, Nishant, for your rage writing on the statement, for everyone coming together in such short notice. I know how stretched thin, and it's a true joy to meet you all that are doing such important work for the community. And if you're thinking about a PhD program, reach out. We're going to be recruiting next year. We finally got some decent funding, just saying. So anyway, thanks so much for all of you for making time. This was really powerful and transformative. So muchas gracias. Yeah. Thank you.
good night, everyone.